name is Jacob Goff. I've been working as electrical engineering training at STAR now for 2 years, a little over 2 years. And before that, I was an intern with STAR, much like McCade Kleinknecht and Mitch Heltemus. STAR does that quite a bit. We hire interns, and I work directly under Randy Schmidt and Christy Robinson. They're both great resources, and this is the first of a series of kind of lunch and learn type webinars that we're going to be talking about topics that come up frequently, and rather than have internal meetings at STAR and share this information to all of our clients individually, we thought that we could do a recorded webinar that people can then go back and look at. We can talk about these topics as a group instead of one-on-one. So the first one here is on work order coding. So if you ever have questions, you can always come to your engineer. I know I've worked a little bit with a lot of the participants here, but each of you has their own engineer that you can go to, and you can also go to your GFR and ask questions. I know they like when you ask questions and ask for permission rather than ask for forgiveness. So with that, we'll get going. Presentation will work. All right, so what is the project coding system? Basically, it's a series of numbers. A lot of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with these, but hopefully this is a little bit of a refresher. It could be referred to as construction work plan codes, 740C codes, work order codes. There's lots of different ways to talk about these. They all mean the same thing. So I won't spend too much time on the history of these, but back in the 80s, essentially the federal government didn't know where the money that they were giving to cooperatives was going. So they decided that they needed to be able to audit and have a better way of tracking things. So they formalized their procedures, and now we have the coding system that we know. So the point of this, as far as the feds are concerned, is it gives them an audit trail, but it also helps them have a national uniform system, in that the bureaucracy of the feds, now a co-op in Georgia will have the same coding system as a co-op in Minnesota. It also helps have a common understanding among borrowers, RUS, consulting engineers. We need all the help we can get. It also helps just so the front office and billing will have the same understanding as staking and operations. So it helps with the preparation of construction work plans. We've been doing these since the 80s, so we have historical data on how much your cooperative has spent on new services and on new construction. And we've got all of this historical data that we then use in a construction work plan detail. So we can break all of these individual codes out and have an exact or a more precise dollar figure in your construction work plan, rather than kind of just guessing on last year's operation and maintenance budget was X amount. So next year's will be that same amount plus whatever percent. We'll actually be able to have some detail. And of course, your construction work plan loan is what all of this is gearing towards, and it provides accountability and auditing. So kind of an overview. All of the codes are separated out based on plant type. So and this is particularly useful for budgeting purposes, but all of the people on the video or on this webinar are probably mostly involved with the distribution codes, so 100 through 700. But transmission generation also have their own set of codes. You may or may not use headquarters or any of the other codes. but it's based on plant type. One thing I should mention is that for your construction work plan, if you've got, say, if you wanted to include distribution codes as well as generation codes, say you wanted to put up a big wind turbine or a solar grid, you'd be able to have the 1 through 700 codes as well as the generation, the 1200 code under the same work plan, but you would not be able to share funds between the generation and distribution. So if your generation costs more than you originally went to RUS to get a loan for, you would not be able to drag funds from distribution into generation. So something to be aware of with that. The project categories are more or less broken down into site-specific and non-site specific. So codes 200 through 500 are site-specific. And I added in 1600. 1600 is a minor project, which we'll talk about that at the end. But it kind of doesn't fit in with the rest of them. But we'll cover that later. So site specific, what does that mean? Basically, these are projects that are identified where the location is known ahead of time, or if it's missed or it comes up after the construction work plan is approved and completed, an amendment can be done, but each of these will have their own unique subcode. So for instance, if you were going to build 3 substations, each one would have their own code. So they'd be 400, 401 and 402, for instance. All of these are specifically covered in your environmental review. If they are amended into a construction work plan, you have to complete an environmental review along with as part of the amendment. So the general ones are not specifically covered in environmental review because they meet the classification of 7 CFR 1970.53 CAT-X, or categorical exclusion, which means that they don't need an environmental review. Each of these, so you would only have one 101, for instance. You wouldn't have a 103, 104. They don't get a unique number for each specific project. So you could have multiple under the same code, which we'll talk about in a little bit. All right. So these are specifically the distribution codes, and I added 1600s at the end too, but 100s are new tie lines or consumer extensions, or new lines, excuse me. 200s are new tie lines, 300s are conversion line changes, 400s are new substations, switching stations, metering points. 500s are substation changes, 600s are the miscellaneous, and we'll go through them in detail. 700s are kind of the other ones that, at least as far as having a work order coded as a 700 is kind of rare. So I'll touch on them, but we won't cover them in great detail. And then of course, 1600s are minor projects. So we'll get started right away with the 100s. So new lines or consumer extensions. A 101 is underground, 102 is overhead. One of the more common errors in coding that I've seen is the staker or whoever is assigning the code to the work order just flip-flops these. So just remember that 101 is underground, 102 is overhead. This designates the construction of new line to serve new load, and the key word there is new. Really, any line where there was no previously existing line that's being built for somebody that's not already a member or is adding a service, excuse me, that can be a 100 code. And this includes primary and secondary conductor. It's a non-site specific code, so you don't need an amendment and you don't need environmental review. It includes poles, pole top assemblies, guides, anchors, conductor, miscellaneous things like arresters, grounding, basically anything you need to get a new service installed is included in this 100 code. So here's kind of an example. You could think of there's a development here, and there's a cul-de-sac that they may be added on. The purple line you could think of as an existing conductor, whether it's 3-phase or single phase, doesn't matter. And the red lines would be new conductor. Anything in red could be initially installed under a 101 or 102 work order. One misconception that I had when I first started is that 100s had to be for a single member, kind of like a 602, but that's not correct. You can put as many services on a 100 code as long as they're all brand new. So 200s are new tie lines, and they are site specific. So these will have a unique extension, 201, 202, etc. This is new construction for the purpose of tying two existing circuits or substations together. It's for transferring load, reducing voltage drop or conductor loading, and providing alternate feeds for construction to increase system reliability. So the actual material that's covered under a 200 is very similar to a 100. A lot of times you maybe wouldn't have secondaries and that type of thing on a 200, but it would be covered. It includes, same types of things: poles, pole top assemblies, guides, anchors, etc. So if we look at our example of this cul-de-sac, say you wanted to add in another chunk of primary conductor so that you could have a loop feed through this, that would be a perfect example of a very small 200 project. But it could also be, adding a big 3-phase tie between substations. If you do come to a point where, well, why don't we just make this a loop fed cul-de-sac in the first place, I would recommend either talking to your GFR or your engineer about what you should do and how you should code that, because technically it is a tie line. It's tying basically from the same point at the beginning and the end, but you now have two available ways that you could feed this. So just check on that with your GFR, but typically they don't look too closely at the 100 codes, but if you did get audited, they might ask you about this. So 300s, this is conversions and line changes. So again, these are site specific. The big key word to this is you're changing existing primary circuits, and it's typically some sort of an upgrade. It's to more than one, so more than one consumer. The classic example of this is you've got an overhead line and you want to bury it. You need to include these. If you know ahead of time about these projects, you need to include them in your construction work plan as a 300. And in your construction work plan, you need to include the verbiage that it includes tap conversions and changes or does not include tap conversions and changes. So these are very similar to 1 and 200s as far as what what it includes. Replacing conductor, adding conductor. So if you went from single phase to three phase, if you were changing system voltage, I know some of you guys have kind of a mix, like you've got some 4 kV low towns, and you might want to build a tie to them with your legacy systems and convert them over to 7200, and you'd be able to do that under these 300 codes. If you know of any road moves, you should include them in 300s at the beginning of your construction work plan. And if any come up, which we all know, a lot of times they don't give you a lot of heads up, hey, we're going to rebuild this road in next year or the year after, and you might be halfway through your work plan. You'll need to submit an amendment and do your environmental review and go from there. So this does not include increase in service capacity, which is code 602. They may look similar on paper, but if it's for a single member, you can do it under a 602, and there's a far less hoops to jump through in a 602 than a 300. And it also does not, if you're replacing like for like conductor, and it's not a site-specific project at the beginning of your construction work plan, you can include it as a 608. If you do know of specific areas, you should include them as 300s. But later on, after your construction work plan is approved, you can just do them as 608s. A full environmental review is required if you're changing types of conductor. So if you're going from overhead to underground, you'll need to do an environmental review. If you're converting overhead to overhead or underground to underground, a full-blown environmental review is not required as long as you are in the same conductor path. If you're going to cross the road, you will need an environmental review. That brings us to 400s. This is new. The keyword is new: substations, switching stations, and metering points. Again, these are site specific, so each substation would get its own code, 401, 402, 403, etc. Basically anything that you need for a new substation, new transformer, regulators, reclosers, bus work, dirt work, ground grid, fence, it's all included in this 400. And you can also purchase land under a 400 code, but there's a few limiting conditions and caveats to it all. And I'll try not to spend too much time on this, but basically you have to have a long range plan that says that you're rebuilding this substation, and your timing on it through the construction work plan is not more than 4 years ahead or behind when the long range plan says that you need it. You have to consider other alternatives, engineering, environmental, otherwise. You can't use RUS funds under 400 if you do the work first. You have to do the environmental review before breaking ground on these if you're going to use funding for the land. And if the project is canceled after you purchase land, then you have to sell the land and replace the funds in the construction fund trustee account. So 500s are closely related to 400s. This is any existing substation changes. These again are site specific. So adding or replacing equipment such as transformers, reclosers, metering. This would also be if you're changing out, say you've got old string bus that's not big enough or is just in poor condition, you can You could replace your bus work under a 500 code. A classic example of this would be, say you want electronic reclosers in your substation, or you're changing out your regulators, that would all fall under this 500. Another thing to note is that you may not need a full-blown environmental review for a 500 code. As long as you're making changes within the fence of a substation, you don't need an environmental review. You still have to submit a statement saying that an environmental review is not required in place of the environmental review. So that brings us to 600s. So there's a whole bunch of 600 codes. These are non-site specific. Environmental review is not required for these because of the categorical exclusion. You have to have historical data on these to justify them in your construction work plan. You can't just pull these out of a hat. Usually that's not an issue though. If it doesn't fit under a 600, then you have to do an amendment with either a 2, 3, 400 code, or if it's under $100,000, you can do it as a 1600. So we'll jump right in. 601 is transformers and meters, including new and upgraded transformers and meters. One interesting thing about this is you should never have a work order that's coded as a 601, because transformers and meters are typically considered as special equipment. So this is really mostly useful for budgeting purposes. And with that, if you have any non-AMR or AMI meters, they need you to specify when you purchase them if they're AMI or AMR, and they also need to know if it's single phase or three phase. All of the other infrastructure needed for AMI systems is included under a 700 code, and we'll talk about that later. So your receivers, your transmitters, your hardware, software, training, all of that can be included, but not under the 601. So this example is pulled right out of the guide for project coding that the general field representatives, or your GFRs, came out with. So here they've got the different types of meters all separated out, and the number of them you put in per year, the total in your construction work plan, the cost, and however many dollars that is extended. One thing that we've seen some of our clients do is they also track single phase and three phase transformers like this. And that's particularly useful for our construction work plans, as we can budget a little bit better ahead of time if we know roughly how many three phase services you might be putting in a year and how many single phase. You also need to include a footnote that includes average costs, such as installed labor, meter sockets, basically the total cost to install all of this. And that gets back to it being these being special equipment. And special equipment is its own conversation that we don't have time to dive into today, but 602s are service changes or increase in service capacity, you might know it as. These are one of the most common and most useful codes that you might have as on a work order. And we can't stress this enough. The most important thing is that a 602 has to be for a single consumer. You can't upgrade several people and their services on a 602. It has to be for a single consumer. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it includes service conductor, secondaries, primaries, If you had to convert secondary conductors to primary, it would include that. If you're going from single phase to three phase, this is for the majority of work orders that I see that are coded wrong. They should be coded correctly as a 602, but they're under something else. So, if you've got your rule of thumb is if it's for one member, it can be a 602. I did have a conversation with one of the GFRs from Minnesota, Robin Jensen, just the other day. The verbiage in the project coding guide that I got from Robin doesn't mention any verbiage of increasing service capacity, but I asked her about that, and she said that the code itself in the rules that RUS hasn't changed in many years. So you should be increasing capacity somehow. If that's, replacing 8A copper with new 1-aught, or if you're going from a 100 amp meter socket to a 200 amp meter socket, as long as you're increasing and upgrading somehow, that should be fine. But we've also seen them accept these. For instance, a development comes through and there's 4 services being fed out of one transformer, and they've got temporary power to one place, and rather than run a whole new service or change things, they just shorten the secondaries or move the meter socket on the building. That could still be potentially coded as a 602, but that's one where you maybe want to talk to your engineer or your GFR about that before you code that as a 602. 603s, line sectionalizing equipment. So this is anything that is sectionalizing, so breakers, reclosers, sectionalizers, fuses, switches, arresters, platforms are all included in that. So this is anything that's required to complete the job. It's not just the reclosers themselves. It would also be if you had a cluster bracket or if you had a controller for an electronic recloser. All of that's included. A lot of times reclosers are considered special equipment, and they might not get their own work order coded as a 603, but a very useful application for 603 is if you've got, say, a pad mount or even an air brake pole mounted switch. Switches are technically sectionalizing equipment because they've got the ability to sectionalize out faults. So you can open and close your lines and refeed things. If you've got reclosers or breakers inside a substation, they would go under a 500, not a 600 or 603. 604 is very similar to 603, but it's for line regulators. So it's again, regulators are oftentimes special equipment, but you can have a 604 work order that includes the installation of the regulator, and that includes, a lot of times if you've got a 3-phase bank of regulators, you need to install another pole and a platform. All of that's included under a 604. .605 again is similar to 603 and 604. It's for capacitors and reactors. Again, it's anything that you need to install: switches, arresters, bypass fusing, controls, cabinets. It's all included in 605. There again, if you're in a substation, that would go under 500. 606 is pole replacements. So as long as the main reason that you're doing the work is to replace the pole, you could also include other equipment such as cross arms, anchors, all of it can be lumped under the 606, which is nice. Or you can separate it out specifically as 606 and 607. A lot of times these are blanket type work orders. So if you've got a map with 30 poles that have been rejected, you can put all 30 poles under a 606. We've also seen these, one of our clients had a bunch of streetlights for a neighboring town. And the streetlights were just kind of an old-fashioned wooden pole with a street light up on top, and the city came to them and asked them, hey, we'd like you to change them out to this decorative pole. And we worked with the GFR and decided that a 606 actually made the most sense for them to do, because they were changing out the poles and the street light with it. So 607 is, as long as you're not replacing the pole, or the pole is not the driving cost of the work, anything else kind of falls under the 607. So guys, anchors, cross arms, switches. As I mentioned earlier, you can combine activities with a 606 as long as you are replacing the pole. It's important to note that for 606 and 607, this does not include, and I repeat, does not include conductor replacement. Conductor, anytime you touch the conductor, it has to be a 608 or a 602 or a 200 or a 300 code, depending on your application. So we've also seen these 607s. It always used to be in the verbiage in the guide is geared towards overhead. So guys, anchors, cross arms, that sort of thing, but it also includes cabinets for underground and basements, that sort of thing, as long as it has an RUS number to it. 608s are non-site specific conductor replacements. So faulty cables, any rebuilding of cable, as long as you didn't know about it in your construction work plan ahead of time and you are in the same right of way, and being in the same right of way is important. You can include these as a 608. It's mostly there. I shouldn't say mostly, but it's also very useful in budgeting. You know, a lot of cooperatives are wanting to attack their old copper lines and replace them. A lot of cooperatives are looking at replacing unjacketed cable. A 608 is a perfect application for them. And it can also include treatments such as cable cure, so be aware of that. So that's the majority of the 600 codes. There are a handful more that are less common but could be useful. So there's unassigned codes. These are useful. You can work with your GFR to set up a code. Say you wanted to specifically and actively spend money on replacing elbow arresters on your system. You had a bad batch when you originally started installing these, and you want to put, say, $500,000 over the course of your construction work plan towards replacing these arresters, on top of all of your miscellaneous replacements that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. You can include that as a 609, for instance. And then that 609 will have a specific detailed budget item in your construction work plan. 612 is for step up or step down transformers. If you've got a dual voltage system, you may need to deal with this, but just know that step up and step down transformers are not included under 601, and they're never special equipment. So the installation, if you need platforms or basements or anything else, is included under the 612. 613 is min-max meters. I think with the invention of AMI or AMR systems, that min-max meters are kind of going by the wayside. But again, they're not considered a 601. If you had any, you could include them as a 613. 615 is communications other than fiber. So if you're installing towers or radios, antennas, et cetera, for your trucks or for communications, that would all be included under the 615. Anything associated with AMI or AMR is not included under this. That has its own code under 705. 616 is smart grid fiber. So this is your fiber connections. If you wanted to, you could bury fiber to all of your substations and office buildings. If you had electronic line reclosers, you could bury fiber to them and or run overhead fiber. I don't think this is used a lot, but it's there if you need it. And there's also a new code, or at least new to the project coding guide, and it's pole restoration and trussing. So I don't think it's used very often in distribution, but if you ever had to band a pole, you could include that under the 618. It does not, in general, include chemical treatments unless you're also banding or trussing the pole. So as long as you're banding or trussing the pole, anything else you do to it could be under the 618. 700s. I won't spend a lot of time on these, but there's a few changes that have been made in recent years. So 701 is now unassigned. It used to be engineering fees. I think it was called engineering fees just for budget purposes, but engineering is not technically reimbursable under your construction work plan through your RUS loan. So they changed the name away from engineering fees, and it's now just an unassigned code. 702 is any new security lights. It's pretty straightforward. 704 is load management and SCADA. So you can also include this for any hardware that you have at your office for load management and SCADA, but also in your substations. You don't have to have a 400 or a 500 code for SCADA if you're doing strictly SCADA work on a work order. 705 is AMR and AMI substation receivers, computer hardware training, any miscellaneous costs to do with that besides the meters themselves. 706 is broadband over power line, and 707, 8, and 9 are GIS related. So.
Hey, Jacob?
Yes.
Can we go back to the 701?
Yes.
So this is Chrissy. Just to give you some background, just so you're not misled, we used to have to, this is a long time ago, engineering fees would be separate. Today, engineering fees are actually rolled into your work order, just like when the line crew goes out, their time goes to the work order. So even if they're coded to 580 or whatever it may be in your accounting system, those costs get spread to one of these codes, whether it be a 600, a 100, or whatnot. And it does get wrapped in to RUS funding. It's just, it's not separately line itemed anymore, just as a clarification.
Thank you, Christy. All right, so the last thing that I want to touch on is 1600s or minor projects. So there's quite a few requirements for 1600s, but they can be very useful. So anything under $100,000 that does not fit under a 600 code. So for instance, you've got a new tie line, but it's just a short tie and it's under $100,000. You could code that as a 1600. it's got less hoops to jump through than a normal amendment does. So this $100,000 is the actual construction cost, not considering salvage or contribution and aid. And you cannot apply general funds to reduce the amount so that it gets under that $100,000 threshold. The true cost has to be under $100,000 from the beginning, or it won't qualify. This basically is saying that if you're missing an important code, say, we actually had this, one of our clients had a construction work plan that the 604 code for regulators was omitted. It wasn't a star made construction work plan. It was a previous engineer that will remain nameless. They missed 604 and a couple other codes that they needed to spend RUS money for. You have to submit an amendment for those. You can't just call it a 1600 and say it's good. If you're missing security lights, you can't just code them as a 1600. The description for 1600s is also very important. It's the verbiage of a description for 1600s would be very similar to like a 300 or a 200 code. You have to mention what's being retired, the type of land that it's on, what's being built, the type of land that that's on, the topography, any special considerations for waterways, habitat, endangered species in the area. An environmental review is required for a 1600, but typically they're not as involved as a true amendment, and that's really, they're faster, and you don't have to wait for responses on things from SHPOs and TIPOs as much. So that's one of the reasons why we like these. So an example description would be you're retiring that many feet of single phase 8A copper weld copper overhead, and you're installing underground. Some of it's in public road right of way, some of it's in private road right of way. You did not traverse any waterways. If you did, you should mention that you'll get the proper any permits that you need from the DNR or whoever your governing agencies are. You're not disturbing any habitat where endangered species are located, etc. So these are useful for like if you've got small projects, like a good example is road crossings. It doesn't pay to build to amend in a 300 code just to bury road crossings. You can do that under a 1600 because it'll be under $100,000, and you'll still do an environmental review. It just won't be as in depth. One important thing to mention on 1600s is I believe it was Dennis Rankin was the RUS person who was reviewing all 1600s in the United States, and he just recently retired. So there's been some discussion that the way that 1600s are processed and the requirements for them might be changing in the near future, but we don't know what any of those changes are yet. Some co-ops are trying to get away from 1600s for that reason, but we're at STAR, we're basically just going to continue as normal until we're told different, because they've worked for the past however many years, since the 80s basically, and they should work in the future unless they change things. So Another very important thing about 1600s is you need to do the environmental review before the work is completed. A lot of times clients will come to us and say, here, we did this job and we'd like to get it inspected. We'd like it on our 219s. Can you do the environmental review after the work is completed? And that used to be okay, and it's no longer. We can't stress it enough that you need to do the environmental review before you complete your 1600 projects. I got some sources here. The Guide for Project Coding and Construction Work Plans, they had a new one released in August. If you don't have that, it's a great resource. Otherwise, you can always come to your engineers. Christy is a wonderful resource. Talk to your GFRs. Again, they like when you ask questions, and they'd rather you ask for permission rather than for forgiveness. So, any questions?
We got a question in Nobles.
Yeah.
If the Star Energy invoices, if they are getting charged directly to, like, if you're working on our Lismore substation, we can put that labor to the substation work order, correct?
Absolutely. That's a perfect example of why they got rid of engineering fees. They can be wrapped right into the costs of that work order. And that goes for any projects, 200s, 300s, 600s, it's all included. We've had some clients prefer that if we know the work order number, that we include that in the description so that it makes it through billing. But a lot of times we get calls and say, hey, can you help us with this project? And we never know the work order number. But if you have that, you can give it to us and that'll help you with on your billing side.
North Itasca has a question.
Yeah.
We're getting a request from our members to relocate their existing overhead service to an underground service. They are paying an aid to construction. Usually comes up between 50 to 70% of the job, depending on, some of these do affect more than one location. How would you be running those, or what would you recommend? I mean, we shouldn't be doing environmentals on private property in somebody's own front yard, should we?
Yes, you do still have to do an environmental review because it affects, there probably won't be historical location.
Hey, hang on a second, guys. Question for North Itasca. Are you ending the job at one consumer or multiple consumers?
We can end the job at one consumer.
Okay, if you're ending the job at one consumer, it's still a 602, even if you're updating line that happens to affect other end users. But if you're ending the job at one consumer, it's just a service capacity increase.
Okay, even though it's an overhead to underground conversion?
So with for 602, you have to have some component changing in size.
Okay,
and that could be the member's service themselves.
I would say yes. Every one of these service upgrade request is usually what triggers these. They want to upgrade from 100 amp or 200 amp service. Well, at the point where they would like to bury the 600 feet crossing their yard so they don't have to look at the poles or have any more trees cut. You know,
Yep.
It usually spawned by a revamp.
A great use for 602s that you might not think about either is, say there's a member that's 4 miles from 3-phase and there's, 10 or 15 members ahead of them on a single phase tap. If that member at the end of the line wants to get 3-phase, the whole line can be converted to 3-phase under a 602. Regardless of the other members, that's just good for them. so long as the driving factor is one consumer.
Okay. Thank you.
So this is Christy. I just want to bring up two things that we see, well, every now and then that you've got to be aware of. If you ever have a long work plan project, like something that's 4 miles or 8 miles long, and you do not get it completed in 1 year, you really should be telling the engineer ahead of time to break that work plan project up. RUS really does not like to see the same 740C code on multiple work orders. So let's say you do half of a 4 mile job in 2020 under work order 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you do the second half of that 300 code in 2021 under work order 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. RUS is going to have a hard time processing the 219 because now that 740C code showed up twice. Okay. So it does help when you talk to your engineer when we're making the work plan that if we do identify a long project and you don't think it's feasible that you can get it done in 1 year, you let us know and we make it into basically 2 300 code projects. The other thing, go ahead.
For example, we will do, say we'll do a 2 mile conversion of grid underground, and we will save the retirement until winter time due to the frozen ground. So a lot of times the retirement will be in the following year. We're still using the same 740C code.
Correct. Yep, that's okay. It's more so when you're trying to close out a 219. So we've gone and done inspections for, you want to get your 219 and you want to draw down some cash. And RUS will turn around and say, well, on your last 219 that you turned in, you already used this code.
Okay.
And then now it's showing it up again. You can't do that. RUS has a hard time processing it.
Okay, so the install portion may have already been closed on a 219, let's say 3 months before that. And then we're going and doing the retirement and using the same 740C code. Are you saying you shouldn't be closing that?
Right. So, okay. So RUS, like every other entity, is going through a change of personnel. The people that used to process the 219 forms, they understood what co-ops were doing. What we're starting to find is the new hires don't quite understand that kind of idea where you have basically 2 different work orders, one retirement, one install, that are listed twice on 219s, different forms, because they're closed at different times. That's going to cause you more issues in the future. It is better to keep that work order open, even if you are tracking it on like 2 separate work orders, one's retirement, one's construction. They really need to close in the same month together.
Okay.
Okay, it's gonna help on the finance side of actually getting funding back, just because of all the new people in DC and some of the auditing we've been seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think with that, we can start wrapping things up. I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their days and sitting and listening to me. Again, if you've got any questions, talk to your engineer or your GFR. We hope to do these kind of lunch and learn type presentations, hopefully quarterly going forward. I know we got our next one is planned, I believe, for January already. And there'll be different engineers doing the presentation, and hopefully it was a refresher, if nothing else, for you guys, and hope you have a good rest of your day.